there was this article I read called Trump's Red Pill Podcast Tour by Helen Lewis of The Atlantic. Connor, I believe you read this too?
Yeah.
Now, from my point of view, the summary of this article is, in the past few months, Donald Trump has been relying on alternative media outlets like Logan Paul, Theo and Lex Fridman's podcasts, often associated with the manosphere, to boost his appeal and increase turnout among young men. Now, I'm not saying like this is the reality. I'm saying this is what the article is saying. Like, is that I think that's a fairly accurate representation of the article.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with it. I mean, it's an opinion piece, so it was written from a very, slightly condescending, very partisan liberal point of view, and that's fine. That's you're entitled to that in an opinion piece.
I agree. I agree about the condescending thing. Helen Lewis clearly is not a Joe Rogan fan, not a Theo Von fan, just does not, I'm wondering like what podcast she listens to. Maybe she's a Pod Save America gal. I'm not sure, but they seem to like try to like, I think these are good podcasts. I used to listen to Joe Rogan. Okay, like I don't really anymore, strictly because I don't think I have time for 3 hours of Bert Kreischer getting drunk. I just don't really have time for those kind of conversations. I move a little bit more to reading. I can get more information in less time there, and that's important to me. But I recognize these are good platforms. This is good strategy. Courting young, especially disaffected young male voters, it's not a bad idea. Courting disaffected voters worked for him in 2016. That's how Trump wins, is by bringing out people that don't vote. And I can't think of a better demographic to kind of shoot for right now than young disaffected men. So this is not a, and I think Rogan's like, people like to paint him as like a right winger, but I think he's obviously like a disaffected liberal. And I think that's why like a lot of people like listening to him. But it's like this is a good sound strategy if Trump wants to win. That's my impression. And by like trying to belittle it, like look at this. I'm going to read from this. This is a quote from the article. The funniest component of the Trump campaign's media strategy so far is its commitment to dipshit outreach. The Substacker Max Reed wrote last month. The constellation of influencers with whom Trump has become enmeshed does not yet have a widely accepted name. Manosphere comes close because it links together the graduates of YouTube prank channels, UFC, boss Dana White's sprawling empire, shit posters on Elon Musk's X, and the male-dominated stand-up comedy scene. This is a subset of the podcast world with its own distinct political tang. It is suffused with the idea that society's become too feminized and cautious, and the antidote is spaces dedicated to energy drinks, combat sports, and saying stupid things about Hitler. Think of this as Trump's Red Pill Podcast Tour. I mean, how condescending can you get? They're obviously not trying to court the young, disaffected male vote. They're calling them shit posters and dipshits. Like what's Helen Lewis doing? Like, who is she trying to help? Because I read this and even I am like, like, Helen, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, these podcasts are popular, and they're popular. Like you said, they're unfiltered, raw, and real. They provide like long, casual conversations that listeners feel a part of. These are good podcasts. Well, we could talk about Logan Paul's podcast. I don't know about that, but Theo Von's, Theo Von, Lex Fridman, Joe Rogan. These are good podcasts. These are not like.
Yeah, they're good. They're good balanced podcasts. They just happen to be run by manly men, and I think that's a huge problem for our society because, she brought up a point that, society's become over feminized, and you and I had talked about this previously in previous podcasts that we had this massive overcorrection to unshackled, unchained feminism. Which,
well,
in my opinion,
you said the overcorrection. I said I'm not convinced that there was an overcorrection. Although I understand, I understand I can parse through the logic, the thought process. But I'm still on the fence about that.
Sure, yeah. I think what's happening is that a lot of these young men feel disaffected because you can't even have an opinion about society being over feminized without being attacked for it. And, nobody wants to be treated like that, especially young men. And I think it's exactly this sort of language that just contributes to this boiling pot that could boil over in a really dangerous way at any moment now. And, I think a lot of young men, people say, oh, young men are fine and, they're men, and really underneath the surface, they might keep it together because that's what we do best as men. We might not necessarily wear our heart on our sleeve like women do, but, we have feelings and there's a lot going on underneath the surface. And so I think just by virtue of enjoying, watching Donald Trump with Theo Von, that automatically pits the entire establishment against you. They say, oh, you watched that, you enjoyed that, like Theo Von, like a manly man, and like Donald Trump or, whatever, even just watching like the Logan Paul podcast, like that automatically just pits you as this, oh, you're just a man, you must be just a mansplainer, huh?
Well, I do feel like people that watch for when I watched the Logan Paul one, I was like, if you like this podcast, maybe you are a dipshit. But to conflate that with Rogan, Theo Von, Lex Fridman, I mean, I think like, yeah, young men are clearly not fine. Young men are clearly hurting, at least a large enough subset of them. Now I know, like when I used to listen to these podcasts, so I used to listen to Rogan, I used to listen to the offshoots of that. Now, I was just spending a lot of time on the road. I was delivering groceries for Instacart. I spent a lot of time on the road. I was kind of lonely. I was relatively lonely, and I wanted to feel like part of like a camaraderie, a group. And so when you watch those podcasts, you really do feel like you're like one of the guys. It's like a good feeling, and it makes you feel good. And they do talk about like Theo Von, especially. Like, now I'm not overly familiar with his podcast, but I do know that he opens up a lot about his struggles with addiction, and I think like a lot of like young men can relate to that and appreciate his honesty and his vulnerability when it comes to that. And so it's like, when big political figures like Kamala Harris do not go on these shows, like they're losing a big opportunity here, because like appearing on these podcasts, and you know what, like people like Bernie Sanders, like went on Joe Rogan. It was a great podcast. Cornel West went on Joe Rogan. It's a great podcast. This isn't something that liberals just don't do, but Kamala doesn't, and Biden doesn't. But it's just like, these podcasts make people at least feel like they're getting a better sense of who these like big untouchable political figures are, humanizing them a little more. I mean, Trump came across as generally a real guy and not just some scary monster in these podcasts. Now, I mean, he's been around the block for a long time, so if anyone knows how to construct an image, in that kind of way, like he's pretty good at that. So you could say it's all fake or whatever, but it doesn't matter, because it matters like what it comes across as. The optics is what matters. And so it's like the
people's choice in that way,
yeah.
It's like Gorbachev, the Soviet Union, when he came to power as, this anti-establishment reformer. And instead of just doing these, highly curated, it's the equivalent of, a CNN or MSNBC or a Fox interview. He would go out and just have like ad hoc conversations with, Soviets on the streets, with everyday Russians and so forth. And people like that. They're like, oh man, like you're not reading from a teleprompter, or you're actually going to answer just my question that I just threw out to you on the fly. Like,
oh yeah, Bernie did that when he was running for like his state and stuff. He went out to like malls and talked to people, right. Just like a normal person. He had a public access show.
And Kamala Harris would be wise to do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think she can go on at least go on like, although Walls did go on, I think, what was it, Pod Save America? I didn't listen to that, but I hear it's good. It sounds like, but it's like, I don't know, Kamala can do one. But wait, going back to that Theo Von thing, because I did find this interesting, though, because it's like, sure, he comes across like kind of human, which is good, because he is a human. Like, even if you want to call him a monster or whatever, he's still a person, and he comes across that way in these podcasts. But when they're talking about addiction specifically, like in the Theo Von podcast, especially, like that was, for some reason, I felt a sense that Trump was fleecing Theo Von a little bit, because like I know that Trump, well, he doesn't do alcohol. He doesn't drink alcohol, doesn't smoke cigarettes, doesn't do drugs. And I know his brother, he opens up about his brother's problems with addiction. So I know he has like actual like experience with addiction. But when he tries to paint himself as the man that can solve the opioid epidemic, I mean, like, I'm sorry to put it plainly, but he didn't do shit. like about that. Like it rise. In fact, it surged exponentially. Fentanyl, it's like under his watch. So I would have loved Theo Von and this isn't Theo Von's job. He's not a journalist. He's a podcaster that's trying to facilitate casual conversation. That's why people like him. That's what he should do. He's not a journalist. But it would have been nice going, well, what did you do, Trump? Like, why didn't you fix it? Like when you were there, you ran on it, you didn't fix it. Now you're running on it again, and I expect you to fix it. But instead he was like, yeah. He was like, just like lapping up these talking points, which is Trump's bread and butter, the opioid epidemic. He loves like reiterating that, even though, like I said, I'm not convinced he's actually did anything to alleviate it. But it's like, but that's not their job. These aren't hard-hitting journalists. And even Lex Fridman, who's like the most respected of these things, like his job is not to catch people in lies. His job is to make them feel comfortable enough to talk as a human being and to facilitate a free-flowing conversation, which is why people like those shows. It's like, so like as much as I think Trump's a con artist, I think, like I said, and I said this last week, you dismiss this demographic at your own peril, at your own risk. I think when elections are this close, dismissing any demographic, no matter how small you think it is a big mistake, But have you seen any of these podcast interviews, by the way, Connor?
With Donald Trump?
Yeah, I watched the Lex Fridman, Theo Von, and Logan Paul one.
I watched a portion of the Theo Von interview.
Theo Von looked a little uncomfortable in that interview. He was like,
maybe a little bit, yeah.
I mean, you're intimidated. It's the former president of the United States. Like, of course you're going to be intimidated. He's asking you about your cocaine habit. It's like you're going to be like, ooh. But that was a pretty decent conversation.
Yeah, no, it was like you said earlier, it humanizes Trump a little bit, where he can sit. I think him and Logan Paul talked about like German Shepherds, or maybe it was another podcast, but just like
they did
non-political issues. They could just be like two dudes, just like talking about dude stuff, like fighting. I think was he talking to Joe Rogan about that? Oh yeah, so and so, he's a real warrior,
he hasn't.
I think it was Theo Von.
Yeah,
it was Theo Von. He was talking. He's like, yeah, no, I was there at that fight. They're talking about sports and stuff like that. So it's just kind of like free flow.
How much do you think of that is strategic pandering, though? On his part?
I mean, it's definitely a political play. I think it's both. It's part political play because he's smart enough to know that everybody's tuning out of legacy media. The only people that watch it are my 70-year-old mom and her 80-year-old boyfriend. So he is wise. He's smart enough. I'm sure Barron, his youngest son, is probably in his ear, and he's almost like this little Gen Z advisor. That's the kind of the way that I think of him. And he says, "Hey, Dad, like you want to really like get in with my crowd, with like the next generation of Americans who are going to be running things soon enough. Go on with Aiden Ross. I didn't even know who that was until recently. I guess he's like a younger, like popular, like video game streamer, very, very popular." And Trump said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So he went on and did a little live stream with Aiden Ross, and he's a man of the people. That's the way. You got to go out and you got to touch grass. You can't just sit at your Senate desk and only talk to your Senate colleagues or people inside the Oval Office. You got to go out and remember who you're serving and look people in the eye and talk about things that humanize you.
But I mean, Kamala's doing that. I mean, maybe she's foregoing the strategy of podcast outreach, but she's touring, she's campaigning, she's going to directly to voters to pitch. So it's like
not authentic.
It's not as if
though.
she's not touching grass. Like she's literally going outside and talking to these voters.
I mean, have you seen the code switching that she does though? That's kind of embarrassing, talking one way to a group of black voters and then talking in a completely different way to a different crowd.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's political strategy, just so I don't blame it. But honestly, when it comes to code switching, we can have a whole conversation about that. I know that I'm guilty of changing. I do, like especially when I'm with my Midwest friends. I was raised in the Midwest. My accent gets very thick. like if I'm only with Michigan people, it just comes out, and that's like a natural thing. I can't control it. I know like some people I went to college with at Michigan, they were from the South, and whenever, but like they were in like sororities with people from Texas, and when you hung out with them, like completely different, like. So it's not as if Kamala Harris is this is some like thing that's only like something that Kamala Harris does. I do think code switching is fairly common, not only
across. It doesn't feel authentic with her, though.
Doesn't feel authentic to you?
No, it feels completely forced and completely fabricated. And I think if it was a natural thing, I don't think it would be an issue in the news cycle. But I think it is an issue because people can sense whether they have enough sense to break it down and say, okay, this is this is not authentic. This isn't somebody who grew up in the South and then lived in New York for many years, and now her accent's coming out again. I know people like that, and it's different.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I'm not that familiar with her early history or whatnot.
I don't want to pick on her too much though, because you can also pick on Trump.
Well, you can't. When I saw the Logan Paul, the Logan Paul interview with Trump is such a joke. Like, it's ridiculous. They start the interview just exchanging merchandise. And the questions that Logan Paul are asking Trump, are like such bootlicking questions. It's like ridiculous. And this was something that like kind of struck me, which I thought was kind of weird, is Trump's painted himself as like, and he uses this, and Logan Paul reiterated it. One of the questions was like, you're a billionaire. Why even do this? Why run for a country that's trying to take you down? Trying to build him up as some sort of selfless martyr or whatnot. But when I look at it, I go, Trump has to run for president. Like, if Trump is in serious trouble right now. I mean, and you can argue about the validity of those crimes or whether or not it's a witch or whatever. But the reality is he's in serious trouble. I really don't think his incentive is a selfless one. I think he needs to win to avoid like litigation for the rest of his natural life, and that was the reality in 2020. 2016 was different. I think it was a money grab, because I mean, we always forget that running for president is very good for someone's like not only profile but their wallet. It's the only reason I can fathom that Jill Stein has continued to run for president. It's just like it raises her profile, it sells more books, she gets more
maybe
followers.
For somebody like her, but not for Trump. Trump was well off. He was plenty well off before
he wanted to start a TV network
in 2016. Yeah, but I don't think becoming president is going to aid him in that. He was already a billionaire. Okay, yeah, you might say, okay, well, becoming the president might boost your image even more, but it's not like he was trying to overcome, the barrier between like being like fairly wealthy, like a lot of politicians, and becoming like very, very wealthy, becoming a millionaire. That barrier had already been broken a long time ago. He's been a billionaire for ages.
There was a barrier that hadn't been broken, and that was Trump has cemented his place in the history books. Before he ran for president, he was on one sphere of, he was a reality TV star, that got his, start and he was like a business tycoon, but his whole thing was like, he's a reality TV star at that point. When he runs for president, he completely transcends just like he becomes a conduit for culture. He's one of the most important figures like of my lifetime, and arguably when the history books are written, he's one of the most important figures. He could be one of the most important figures like in the country's history. So it's like, I do think there was a barrier for him to break. I didn't think that was his incentive. I do think he wanted to start a TV news network. I don't know what his financials were like before he started to run for president. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but I don't think these are selfless campaigns. It's fine. I mean, I think Trump is a shameless promoter. I don't hold it against him. I hold it against him when like it actually like affects people's lives, but other than that, the Logan Paul interview, like the Lex Fridman and the Theo ones were pretty good. Although the Lex Fridman one was kind of interesting because when they talked about Truth Social, I thought that was kind of funny because there was this moment where he was like, Truth is very powerful. Truth My platform, Truth. It was just such like a weird, surreal moment where they're talking about truth, but in the context of his like, and he's bullshitting on the success of Truth. Like he's like, oh yeah, it's very successful. It's like it's not successful. It's bleeding money. Your executives are selling shares. You know, you can't because of the what is it, a lockout or he's unable to sell shares, but it's like got a fraction of the user base is bleeding money. It's not a success, but you know, but that's Trump's shtick is everything is a success, and you know that's fine. But I'm sorry, I feel like we got off track here. I think the most important thing about this article was, you know, like we said, I think these are very good platforms to go on. I think they're only going to help Trump. And I think the condescension, you know, from liberal writers, you know, and liberals in general is a mistake. You know, it really is.